Now, will the UK housing market crash? Now, that's a question nobody knows the answer to for sure. But on this video, I'm going to argue one thing that I argued in the article below, and that's that the UK media doesn't seem to actually want to report on a simple fact, and that's that UK real adjusted to inflation house prices are actually lower than they were 13 years ago. Now, in fairness, you do hear about the ups and downs of the housing market. So, for example, many people in the UK would have heard that, for example, because of coronavirus or lockdown, UK house prices are lower. What most people don't actually know is that actually adjusted to inflation and also earnings, UK's average house prices are lower, as I said, than they were before the recession. So if you look, the recession of 2008. So if you look at a long-term graph of UK house prices, there were the ups and downs, but pretty much from the war until say 92, it was just upwards and upwards, although there were obviously some bumps in the road. 92, there was a very severe, or early 90s, a very severe crash in house prices. And it took about 10 years for them to get back to where they were adjusted for inflation. However, what happened is between, say, the recession in early 90s and 2008, house prices went up a lot in aggregate, even though it took until 2002 for the prices to get back to where they were in the early 90s. So by 2008, UK house prices adjusted to inflation, also adjusted for wages, were higher than they ever were. Now, what's happened since then is, with the exception of London, prices have never actually recovered. So yes, there was a very big dip in house prices for the first year in 2009. Then they did go up again, but they've never fully recovered. So I'll give you an example. The nationwide survey of UK house prices showed that the average UK house price was about £185,000 at the peak in 2008. It then went down to £150,000 and it subsequently went up to about £220,000 before the coronavirus. And you might say, well, that's an increase, but it's not, right? Because if you think about it, that's a £30,000 or so increase. And that is adjusted for inflation actually lower, because it works out at about 1.2% or something per year for the last 13 years. And I think actually it's lower than that. If I worked it out, it was about 18, 19, 20%. But if you actually work it out, it's lower than inflation. As per the graphs and on the article below, even wages have gone up slightly higher than house prices. The question is, though, does this mean the UK is a great place to invest? Because you might say, well, hold on, that means the UK is less expensive than many property markets, and especially with the pound going down, that could mean the UK is a great market to invest in. And I would say two things to that. Number one, I do think compared to Dubai or Japan, which I've reviewed before, the UK property market does have some more positive things. So, for example, rental yields in certain parts of the North or the Midlands are excellent compared to some countries in the world, and also the prices are very low. And if you're an overseas buyer, including a British expat, obviously the pound has gone down, which means that the fall from 2008 is huge, right? If you're using dollars in particular, even euros, it's much cheaper than it was before, even in nominal terms, never mind adjusted for inflation. But I think a bigger issue is house prices got so expensive until 2008 that basically, even though there has been a fall adjusted for inflation and adjusted for average earnings, it's still higher than the historical average. In other words, I think it was something like over 6 to 1. In other words, by 2008, the average house price was like 6 times earnings or something ridiculous. Now it's much lower than that, but it's still higher than it has been historically speaking. That implies that in the next 5 or 10 years, the price of houses, even if they don't crash, should probably go down a bit more adjusted for wage inflation. So especially when you've got a situation like coronavirus, weak wage growth and so on, you would think that the average UK property price is not going to go higher unless there's a huge influx of foreign buyers like what happened in London. But obviously the UK government has really made the taxation regime more difficult now. So I'm not saying there's going to be a big fall in houses or a big crash, but I do think in 10 years' time, it's highly likely that the average UK house price is merely going up at best in line with inflation. In other words, if inflation is 2 or 3% on average per year, which compounded is what, about 30%. Let's say now the average house price in the UK is 220,000. Maybe in 10 years it will be somewhere around 250, 270,000. In other words, I'm not saying it's going to go down in nominal terms, but adjusted for inflation, I think it will probably go down at least a little bit. And adjusted for wage growth, it will lag a little bit, because the UK market in particular does depend on first-time buyers, especially in parts of the country which don't have a lot of foreign buyers.